Congressman Bass is here. He's a senior member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He has to leave at 11:15, so we'll let the congressman go next in order that he can make his comments, and we can allow questions for him immediately afterward. We're going to run over. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you very much, Jim. I can stand right here if you want. People can hear me. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm an old friend of Jim's. We we've known each other for many years and so forth, and I haven't heard all the other presenters today, so I'm not exactly sure what the focus of this meeting is, except that, as from I understand the flyer that I received, that it is a discussion of the potential health impacts of air quality degradation in the state of New Hampshire. If I'm wrong about that, correct me. I serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm not on the Energy and Environment Subcommittee, but needless to say, the committee has had some debates this year about the issue of carbon dioxide and climate change. Let me state from the outset that I think the Clean Air Act is a very important, as was mentioned by our first speaker, environmental effort that was undertaken years and years ago, starting with Dick Nixon back in the late 60s. I'm a runner, and I've been running more or less continuously. It doesn't look like I have, but since about 1966, when I broke my leg skiing, and it was part of the therapy for getting myself back on my feet. And I can say, as you alluded to in your comments, that the everyday quality of the air along roads anywhere in America is so dramatically different now than it was when I first began running. Every car that went by, you get a face full of exhaust, and that's very different now. We're in a somewhat difficult position, however, legislatively and administratively with respect to the Clean Air Act. It was last reauthorized in 1991 under George H.W. Bush, and it was done in a bipartisan fashion, somewhat quietly at first, and then in the end came out of the committee process and was passed and signed into law. There has been an evolving debate over the last 20 years about the impact of carbon dioxide on climate change, and I want to state from the outset that I'm one of the perhaps minority, I'd say definitely minority, of the Republican Party that believes that climate change is a serious national priority, that the science exists to support the need for the country to act legislatively to reauthorize the Clean Air Act and do so in such a fashion so as to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions while at the same time balancing that need to reduce clean air with the need to protect and preserve our society and our economy. Now, as we all know, a couple of years ago, more than that, quite a while ago, a decade ago, or less than that, a case was filed in the, and by the way, I love the screensaver. A case was filed by the state of Massachusetts against the Environmental Protection Agency with respect to climate change, in essence because the state of Massachusetts claimed, at least initially, that they were losing land because the Atlantic Ocean, the level of the Atlantic Ocean was rising. This case, and again, not to get into a long discussion, evolved essentially into the judgment that was rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court in a close decision, in essence tying carbon dioxide to health, not rising ocean, but to health. And it was on that basis that the EPA decided and had the choice, had a range of options, but decided to start implementing under the Clean Air Act carbon sequestration policies. And this has created enormous controversy within the Congress. There is climate change and the environment in general should not be a partisan issue. It should be, if there's a debate to be had, it's traditionally been regional. My party, the Republican Party, has fathered, if you will, or sponsored or been responsible for most of the environmental initiatives that have occurred over the last 100 years. And the debates have primarily been about regions. I was a big advocate for cutting down on fossil fuel emissions in the Midwest, as were every attorney general in the Northeast, because of acid rain, and it worked. I think it's unfortunate that now the issue of environment and climate change has become more of a partisan issue than it should be. And that's why I refuse to acknowledge that that the situation today, at least in terms of the facts, is any different than it was 3 or 4 years ago. Now, there have been mistakes made on the part of those that advocate for climate change legislation. We won't go into those because you can hear that on radio discussions for hours, but we are where we are. The Waxman-Markey bill did not pass. That's that. It's over with. And I think that we need to start anew debating and passing legislation to reauthorize the Clean Air Act. I do not support the EPA's command and control rulemaking process for many different reasons. Number one, I believe that if it were a different issue with a different agency on different basis, doing something significant without the authority of Congress, there would be a public outcry for that too, no matter what issue it was. Secondly, this is not cap and trade that the EPA is involved in. This is just straight cap. And the reason for that is that there is no legislative authority for it, either under the Clean Air Act, but it's based upon a Supreme Court decision. And I think the EPA itself understands that they're on extremely thin or narrow basis to do what they're trying to do, and as a result, there will be a number of court cases pending, and the agency is trying to do what they can to create flexibility in the implementation of what they want to do, so that it actually isn't so draconian that it shuts down large sectors of the U.S. economy. For 10 or 15 years, there has been a very successful debate about climate change as it relates to the environment. Al Gore getting the Nobel Peace Prize, Inconvenient Truth, all of the work that has been done has been based upon the need to reduce carbon emissions because there's a potential environmental impact. I have no doubt that there is also a health impact, but it is not what the debate has been about. And now there's an effort, which is legitimate, of course, by those who support climate change, to shift the debate over to the health side. That is a very hard mountain to climb. All these resources, time, money, debate, and everything else have been spent on linking CO2 increases to environmental degradation. But since that is no longer the justification for what's going on now, rather it's a health debate, that's where the advocates are pushing this. And I agree, the equation that CO2 leads to higher temperatures, which leads to more emissions from vehicles, which leads to more ozone, which leads to more respiratory problems, is probably a legitimate argument. But that is a very hard argument to sell for the kind of legislative initiatives or agency initiatives that are being contemplated by this agency. And I would suggest, my message, I guess, would be that you ought to be encouraging the debate to continue on the science of climate change and its impact on the environment. And it is not going to be useful, especially in this environment, in this geopolitical environment that we have today, to try to support the claim that the environment now is no longer the primary reason for climate change legislation, but rather its impact on global public health. I think there's an understanding that if ozone levels go up for any reason, i.e., we abandon the particulate standards for mobile and stationary sources, that'll do it too, even if the Earth is getting colder. I mean, one way that we could reduce ozone is to prohibit the use of automobiles and no more electricity generation at all. But the point is that the health issue should not be the primary driver for climate change reduction. It should be an environmental debate. That's my message to you. I know it's not the message of this hearing. Jim told me that I wanted to come because I am the sponsor myself of a cap and trade bill. So I'm with you on the issue of climate change, but I don't like the way the EPA has approached the issue of the command and control, as I call it, rulemaking process. And I think it's destined, in the end, in my opinion, to delay the progress rather than to promote it. Because in the end, there will be endless court battles over this. There will be a lot of resources spent, perhaps unnecessarily, in complying with rules that may not end up being in effect for very long. And that I am encouraging, maybe not in the next 2 months or the next 6 months or the next year, the reaction to, the negative reaction to the Waxman-Markey bill to die down, and then perhaps we can begin a bipartisan debate, maybe next year, on a reauthorization of the Clean Act that will lead to some sort of a compromise, a pragmatic process of compromise whereby we can have a Clean Air Act reauthorization. But we can't, go, in my opinion, go forward indefinitely, as is the case now, with nothing, no authority whatsoever from the U.S. Congress and the EPA implementing the regulation of carbon dioxide. So there's my message, and I just want to thank you all, Jim, for inviting me here. And I suppose I'll answer questions if anybody has them. Go ahead.
It doesn't seem to me that there's an either-or on the environment versus health issue, is there? I mean, can it be both issues?
Well, I don't understand.
I mean,
we deal with these issues every day. There's never any perfect solution for anything. But
no, I mean to push for the need for reducing carbon emissions on the basis of environmental goals, and to push for that same goal on the basis of health goals, those aren't mutually exclusive.
That's exactly correct.
So, I mean, it seems to me there's a little bit of
I'm not criticizing
attack in what you're saying. It's not an either-or kind of situation.
Well, the focus of the debate has shifted from environmental impacts to health impacts, and I'm just saying, and the reason for that is because that's what the EPA is doing now. And my point is, shift it back to the environment. I did an interview on Living on Earth last year, and the commentator, the guy who does it, said to me, "Well, isn't the community, the environmental community, is concerned that they're all going to get dragged into the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Science and Technology Committee, these scientists, to defend themselves, and they don't want to do this." And I said, "Why? The number one priority ought to be to continue to attempt and prove the science that carbon dioxide is leading to global warming." But they don't want, again, I don't want to be inflammatory here. This is not religion, this is science. And to some extent, the proponents of climate change have turned this into almost a theological debate, and I want to get back to the science and start re-persuading the American people that there needs to be a public policy initiative in climate change. Of course it leads to health. You've just seen some very good presentations on that effect, but that isn't going to win the argument on the policy side, not only in the minds of members of Congress and senators, but also the public in general. They'll agree with you, but they're not persuaded that the science of climate change is real. Get back to that subject again. Yes?
Okay. So I'm an economist.
Yes.
And so I love talking about the costs and benefits of regulation. And when we think about regulation, we need to think about both the benefits of the health improvements, but we also need to think about the benefits to the economy of regulation. And there are a plethora of studies from MIT, from all across the country, from leading economists showing the benefits of regulation. But I want to get to this question about the science of climate change. I want to just ask you a personal question. Do you have car insurance?
I have liability insurance,
You have
yes.
life insurance. How many here have car insurance? Why do we have car insurance? It's because if we get in an accident, we have huge costs, right? Yeah. So if we have a risk of trillions of dollars in costs when we think about the environmental impacts of climate change, why don't we buy some insurance against that? And that form of insurance could be regulating carbon emissions. So why can't we think about reducing carbon emissions as an insurance? It may not happen. There's always a confidence interval for scientific.
The answer to your question is you should buy insurance provided that insurance doesn't cost more than the car each year.
No.
So,
you buy the insurance provided.
look, I don't want to debate you. Let's go on to other questions. Go ahead.
I have a question. I'm trying very hard to follow your logic. And you're suggesting that the proper approach to this situation for the general public and the politicians is to concentrate on environmental degradation.
Which is what the debate has been until last year.
But environmental degradation, in your thinking, see, my thinking as a mother and grandmother is that environmental degradation not only means warmer temperatures, but an impact on human health. I mean, that's how I define it. So for you to suggest that we put the health impacts aside, to me, is to put the entire conversation, into a realm that doesn't make logical sense. So could you explain?
The health impacts of climate change are different from the environmental impacts. They're different subjects. And my suggestion to you all as proponents of climate change is to get back to the debate on the environment. I have a different, health is different from the environment. There's a nexus. Energy is different from the environment. I mean, these are different subjects. The debate on climate change has changed. I didn't hear a single account in 2 or 3 years ago that focused exclusively on health. It was all about the ice caps. It was all about rising temperatures and how they would affect the Antarctic. I didn't hear anybody talking about asthma. Now, the Supreme Court decision occurred, and it was based upon asthma. And so I'm not criticizing your points. I'm saying that your strategy, get back to the strategy that you had before that was working.
But if there were no health impacts...
There are potential health impacts. I'm not denying any of that.
But then, if there were no health impacts, I wouldn't be here. Because although I would be concerned about the economic impacts, as a mother and grandmother, the health impacts to me loom very large. So for you, and I'm thinking of the article I read yesterday about China and its desertification problem, and the fact that now they're thinking of diverting the Yangtze River to water their lands. There's going to be a huge health impact. There's going to be no food. There's going to be starvation. So for you to suggest get back on the winning track, I think the science of climate change convinced you, correct, sir? You're comfortable with the science of climate change?
I'm comfortable with the science of climate change. I'm not wild about it, but I'm comfortable. It'll never be proven. I'm sure most of the people here believe that there's absolutely no question. There will never be no question about any matter of science. So I am comfortable with it to the extent that I think that we should have a debate about including carbon dioxide and reauthorization of the Clean Air Act. Let's keep going, because I can only do one more question, because I've got to... Go ahead, ma'am, in the back.
Thank you. I think you get it, what I hear you saying is that it's not that you don't understand the health impacts and the science, but that you're down in Washington. There's a strategy that might work and a strategy that won't, and you're telling us this strategy for health is not going to work. And I think, we all are kind of agreeing with what everyone's saying. My concern is that the urgency, that what you proposed makes sense. I've been working on these issues. I wouldn't agree with you that the 10 or 15 years worth of successful debate has been happening around climate change. It sure didn't feel that way, especially the last couple of years, which is, of course, why people have changed the strategy, because people need to have it feel closer at home than the ice caps, in the Arctic. So I understand that change. I understand what you're saying. On the time frame that you put forward, though, if this ruling doesn't go forward with the EPA, it just sounds like we're like, you know, the time frame is just way out there. And I don't know about you, but I feel a lot more urgency to have this addressed than looking at a year down the road.
Well, as somebody said, as people say, it took us 100 years to get where we are now. We're not going to get out of it in a year. And the debate needs to continue. I haven't even gotten into my ideas about how I think from a process standpoint it should be treated. I support, I personally would drop the climate debate on the legislative side completely. I wouldn't even mention the word, and I would support a national renewable thermal and electric standard.
Talked about the success of the clean air initiatives for the past 40 years. That was a command and control effort, really, for 40 years. What you have said with the Upton bill and in public, basically, is to do away with that 40 years of experience. What are we going to look forward to during the next 40 years based on what your initiatives are in Congress?
The Upton bill does not repeal any Clean Air Act. What it does do is it stops the EPA from implementing carbon dioxide regulations based upon the U.S. Supreme Court decision.
Okay, well, isn't that pretty much the same thing?
No.
Well, where's the difference?
The difference is that you said that the Congress moved to repeal the Clean Air Act or change it. We didn't. That's simply not untrue.
Listen, last November, before the election, you kind of gave us Republicans a sense that you kind of got it on climate. You come here today and say, well, science really needs to be investigated. But what you say to us here in New Hampshire is different from what you were doing in Washington, particularly on that Upton bill.
Your statements are incongruous.
You voted for three amendments to that bill, one of which said basically climate science and climate change is a reality, and you voted against that. How can you come back here and tell us, voters in your constituency, that the climate is unsettled and we don't really have enough information, et cetera? You know.
Well, the answer to your question is proposed a substitute for that amendment which said essentially the same thing but added the balance question about the economy. So thank you very much, you guys. Thanks for having me.